The first time I met Michael Landon, it wasn't in a studio or on a screen. It was in the quiet that comes after applause when the audience has gone, the lights have dimmed, and a man is left alone with the sound of his own breathing. People remember the smile, the calm voice, the sense that he was someone you could trust. But the truth is, the Landon that existed off camera was never meant to be seen. He was a man who built a world around himself so carefully that even his family had to learn the rules just to survive in it. The public believed in him because he asked them to. The private truth is that he believed in the myth too, so completely that he could no longer tell where the actor ended and the man began. If you want to understand Michael Landon, you have to understand the cost of being adored. Most people think fame is a gift, but for him it was a mirror that never stopped reflecting. He became the ideal father not because he was naturally perfect, but because he worked at it until he could no longer separate the performance from the person. His children didn't grow up with a father. They grew up with a role model who expected them to behave like characters in a story he controlled. In interviews, he talked about faith, responsibility, and discipline. He spoke as if he were teaching the world how to live. But inside his home, those lessons weren't conversations. They were rules. And rules, when enforced by fear, stop being lessons and become prisons. The Malibu mansion looked like a dream from the outside. Glass walls, ocean views, and endless horizon. But the house wasn't built for living, it was built for control. Leslie Landon later described it as a place without noise, a home where even laughter felt like a disruption. The kind of silence you can feel. If someone arrived late to dinner, their empty chair stayed untouched, a silent punishment that lasted longer than any argument. No one spoke while he ate. Not because he demanded respect, but because he demanded obedience. His children learned early that love wasn't a feeling. They were taught that love was earned by behaving correctly, and when they didn't behave correctly, they didn't get punished. They got ignored. To understand the emotional landscape of that house, you need to imagine a child living under constant examination. Leslie recalls being made to rewatch episodes of Little House on the Prairie, then being asked how Charles Ingalls would have acted in a given situation. It wasn't framed as punishment, it was framed as guidance. But to a child, it felt like a test she could never pass. Imagine being asked to become your father's ideal version of himself. Imagine being asked to live up to a character you never chose. That kind of pressure doesn't build strength, it builds compliance. It builds fear. It builds a kind of emotional silence that follows you long after the house is gone. Michael Landon's work ethic was legendary, and it was also a kind of addiction. He didn't just work hard, he worked until his body stopped arguing. He woke at dawn, ran along Point Dume Beach with a cigarette already lit, and then returned home to write. He wrote through the day, directed in the afternoon, and stayed up late rewriting. The upstairs light was always on. Neighbors saw his silhouette hunched over a typewriter, surrounded by scripts and a glass of bourbon. It looked like dedication. But it was also a form of avoidance. Stillness made him vulnerable, and vulnerability for someone who built a life on being a moral pillar was unbearable. There's a difference between discipline and control. Discipline can be a form of love, control is a form of fear. Michael Landon did not just want his family to be good, he wanted them to be predictable, he wanted their emotions to fit into a schedule. If a child cried, it wasn't because they were hurt, it was because they were out of line. The household ran on rules rather than affection, and the consequence of that was that love became conditional. If you were good, you were loved. If you were not, you were ignored. That kind of love isn't love at all, it's a transaction, and transactions never heal a child's heart. His second wife, Lynn, was caught in that system too. She wasn't just a partner, she was a character in a story he wrote. Friends recall moments when she broke down, overwhelmed by the pressure of living inside a man's mind that never stopped moving. She once left with the children for several weeks, trying to breathe outside the walls of control. When she returned, Landon spoke calmly, almost gently, and told her things would be better if she never left again. The message was simple: the house was his. The family was his, and no one was allowed to leave without his permission. It wasn't love, it was possession. And set the same patterns repeated. Landon's power wasn't only in his talent, it was in his ability to make people fear his silence. When he walked onto the Little House on the Prairie set, conversations stopped, bodies stiffened, the air changed. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to punish, he simply looked away. And everyone understood that the moment they disappointed him, their name might disappear from the call sheet. Child actors especially learned that his silence was worse than any explosion. When he smiled, they felt safe. When he went quiet, they felt the weight of judgment pressing down on them. The production became his kingdom. Every storyline, every line, every performance passed through him. He wasn't just the star, he was the ruler. Mistakes meant endless retakes. Scenes could stretch for hours because he couldn't tolerate imperfection. If something didn't feel right, he would halt filming, drop the script, light a cigarette, and stare into the distance. The set froze, time stopped, and everyone waited not for direction but for approval. It's hard to describe what that does to a person until you've seen it. A room full of talented adults reduced to children by the presence of one man. People described him as brilliant and exhausting, inspiring and frightening. But beneath the public narrative of genius was something else: loneliness. A man who never stopped working was a man who never allowed himself to be seen. His control wasn't just professional, it was personal. He controlled the narrative of his life so completely that he couldn't recognize when he was losing it. And when you lose control, the only thing left is chaos. In his case, that chaos took the form of a relationship that would eventually shatter everything he had built. The affair with Cindy Clerico began quietly, almost invisibly. She was a young makeup assistant, barely out of her teens, doing her job. At first, no one noticed, then they did. She was always nearby. She brought him coffee. She stayed late. Her dressing room light stayed on long after everyone else had gone home. People began to talk, but no one dared to confront him. In Hollywood, power isn't challenged, it's endured, and Landon's power was absolute. The rumor wasn't just that he was having an affair. The rumor was that he was finally letting himself feel something he had denied for years: desire. What's often overlooked is the way Landon changed during that time. He smiled more when she was around. He seemed lighter, almost relieved. But his temper grew sharper, his silences longer. It was as if the relationship gave him permission to be reckless. The man who once used work to avoid vulnerability now used desire to avoid responsibility. The household, already tense, became unbearable. Leslie saw the shift. She watched her father drift away from the family. She watched him stop pretending. The man America loved was being replaced by a man who wanted what he wanted, regardless of who it hurt. The divorce was devastating, not just because it ended a marriage, but because it destroyed the myth. The public saw it as betrayal, the family saw it as confirmation. Leslie didn't cry. She went quiet because silence had always been the language of her home. The father she had believed in was gone, not because he died, but because he chose someone else. The world had built him into a symbol of virtue, but symbols don't feel pain, they don't have weaknesses, they don't leave, they don't disappoint. And when the man behind the symbol revealed himself, the shock was unbearable. The wedding to Cindy Clerico was quiet, but the reaction was loud. Newspapers called it a fall from grace. Fans wrote angry letters, ratings declined. It was as if the public could no longer forgive him for being human, but the truth is Landon didn't care. He framed it as honesty, as liberation. He said he had finally found happiness, but to his children his words felt cold. They felt like dismissal. Like he was saying, I did what I needed to do, and you can either accept it or disappear. That's what control does. It turns people into objects in your story instead of characters in their own lives. And yet, even after the scandal, Landon did not slow down. He doubled down. Work became his refuge again, but now it was also his weapon. He launched Highway to Heaven with the same intensity, the same insistence on perfection. The Universal Studios lot became another kingdom. He arrived before sunrise and stayed after midnight. He skipped meals. He ignored rest. He smoked constantly, carried bourbon in coffee cups, and demanded that the world move at his pace. The people around him learned the same lesson they had learned before: never disappoint him. Because disappointment wasn't a feeling, it was a sentence. But there was a cost. People close to him described him as someone who could be moved to tears by a scene, then become violent a moment later. The emotional swings were unpredictable. It wasn't just perfectionism, it was desperation. He was trying to hold together a life that had already cracked, and the more he tried to control everything, the more everything slipped through his fingers. He was a man who wanted to be a hero, but he didn't know how to be a human. He wanted to be loved, but he didn't know how to love without demanding obedience in return. In the spring of 1991, his body finally forced him to confront the one thing he had avoided his entire life: weakness. Severe stomach pain, a diagnosis: terminal pancreatic cancer. It had already spread. There would be no recovery, no second act. For someone who had built his life around strength, the news was a cruel contradiction. He stood before cameras and spoke calmly, optimistically, insisting he intended to fight. But those closest to him saw the truth. He was already fatting. His weight dropped rapidly. His voice weakened. His movement slowed. The man who had spent decades running from stillness could no longer outrun the end. Even then, he refused to surrender control. Against medical advice, he continued smoking. He continued drinking. Leslie saw it not as rebellion but as defiance. It was the last thing he could decide for himself. When everything else was taken away, he clung to the habits that had defined him. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was fear. Weakness had never been allowed in his world. And now, as his body betrayed him, he could not accept being fragile. The man who had demanded silence from others now faced the loud truth of his own mortality. In his final weeks, the Malibu house grew quiet in a different way. Not the disciplined silence of his rule, but the stillness of waiting. Friends came to say goodbye. He greeted them with short words, a faint smile, never asking for pity. And then one day, Leslie stood in the hallway and watched her brother help their father up the back staircase, carrying the oxygen tank beside him. In that moment, something inside her broke open. She saw him not as a myth, not as a star, not as a father, but as a man who had stopped wanting to live. She understood with painful clarity that the person who had controlled everything for so long was finally powerless. She wanted him to be free, even if freedom meant death. Before he died, Michael Landon reached for his daughter's hand and spoke a truth he had never spoken before. He told her not to live the way he had, to allow weakness to ask for help. It was the only time he admitted fear, and in that confession there was a kind of tragic beauty. Because for all his control, all his perfection, all his power, the man who had played a moral hero on screen ended his life as a human being, fragile, scared, and longing for the one thing he could never give himself: forgiveness. So was he a victim of the image he created or the choices he refused to confront? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the tragedy of Michael Landon isn't that he fell from grace, but that he never learned how to live without it.